Hello everyone, and welcome to a new video. In today's video, I'll be making a chemise à la Reine inspired dress from 10 yards of bright pink silk chiffon. If you're unfamiliar with the chemise à la Reine, it's a garment that was popularized by Marie Antoinette in the latter quarter of the 18th century. It was named after its similarity to the chemise, a garment typically worn beneath a dress, not as a dress. For this, it was somewhat scandalous at the time, but quickly became very popular too, given its comfort and practicality compared to more structured garments. I have a love-hate relationship with the chemise à la Reine. I love it because comfort appeals greatly to me, but I hate it because the lack of structure can make them really unflattering. This was the case with my last attempt based on a pattern from Nora Waugh's book, and it really soured my feelings towards the chemise à la Reine as a whole. So I was hoping with this attempt to redeem myself and end up with a garment that I was actually happy with and happy with how it looked on. And I think I did that. And it's also pink. It's pink because the silk was $7 a yard, I could not resist it, and a chemise à la Reine was the only vaguely historical project a silk chiffon seemed the appropriate weight for. So here we are, and now let's talk about how I made it. I draped the pattern for this myself and drafted it to have a structured lining that the gathered panels sit atop of. This will hopefully prevent the sides from riding up and making me look less like a marshmallow when I wear it. I originally planned on that structured lining being made from a lightweight inner lining, which is what I'm cutting my pattern out from in this footage. The pattern is made up of 4 pieces, one for the front, one for the back, one for the side back, and one for the strap, and they are each cut from 2 layers of fabric. After getting this cut out, I remembered that silk chiffon is chiffon, and it is sheer, so the lining would look better if it was a coordinating color as opposed to white. So I recut all those pieces from pink polyester rayon blend moire. This fabric was pretty thick on its own. If I backed it with the inner lining I cut out earlier, I think the garment would have been too heavy, so I ended up just discarding it. After the base was cut out, I could move on to cutting out the silk chiffon overlay, at least for some of the pieces. The back panel will have a pleated overlay draped on my dress form, and the front pieces will have a gathered overlay cut from a completely different pattern. But the strap and side pieces could have the overlay applied at this stage, and I did this just by pinning the pink lining to the back side of the chiffon, then roughly cutting around them. I roughly cut them out so I don't have to worry much about the edges shifting when I sew them together. They'll be trimmed to the proper size later on, but for now they are just getting set aside. I'm switching focus to the back pieces, and I'm pinning them together at the center back edge with the right sides facing each other. Then I'm using a ruler to mark a few points on each side where I'll be sewing boning channels. That's the second part of my plan to make this flattering. Not only will the lining be fitted, it'll also be boned. This prevents it from collapsing and the garment riding up, which contributed to the marshmallow effect on my first attempt many years back, which was clearly very traumatizing to me. I'm sewing the back pieces together with a 3/4 inch allowance. I pressed that seam open off camera, then I stitched 5/8 of an inch wide twill tape on either side, which I'm using as boning casing. I continued to sew twill tape on along the pencil markings I made earlier. Now I am filling the casing with 3/8 of an inch plastic bones. These are cut to be 1.5 inches shorter than the channels to allow for seam allowance, and the corners are lightly filed so they won't poke through the casing, though that is less of a concern with plastic boning than metal. Now the base for the back panel is done, and as I said earlier, unlike the other bodice pieces, this will have a pleated overlay, which will be draped atop the piece while it is on my dress form. And you can see me doing that in this footage. I opted for the pleated back because it was done on the extant garment I used as a reference for this. Just because it is pink doesn't mean it is totally inaccurate. It's just mostly inaccurate. And I'm doing this while it is on my dress form so I can get a good idea of how the pleats will lay and form to a body, which you don't really get when the piece is flat on a table. I'm also just doing this by eye, working from the center to the edge on one side, then doing my best to mimic it on the other side. After I liked the way the pleats looked, I removed the piece from my dress form and basted the pleated overlay in place by machine stitching around each edge. I'm using a relatively large stitch length for this since I'm really just trying to machine baste it in place. And I'm keeping the stitches within the seam allowance, so no more than 3/4 of an inch away from each edge. This way they will be hidden when the garment is assembled. And I repeated this process for the side panels and the strap pieces, which have the flat silk chiffon overlay I pinned and cut earlier. Now I'm trimming away any fabric that extends beyond the edges of the base layer. It is way easier to do this after basting the overlay down, rather than cutting the overlay perfectly to size earlier on and trying to keep the edges aligned. And I'm all for things that make my life easier. And this was repeated for the side and strap pieces as well. Now I'm pinning the side back edges of the side pieces to either side of the back pieces. These pieces were sewn together with a 3/4 inch allowance. Then off camera, the seam allowance was pressed to the side away from the center back. The strap pieces were then pinned to the back panel and sewn on as well, once again using a 3/4 inch seam allowance. And this seam was pressed open. And now it was time to cut the silk front panels and the skirt panel. I don't have much footage of this, but I cut 2 identical pieces of silk long enough to stretch from my collarbone to the floor. Then I cut 2 identical pieces long enough to stretch from my waist to the floor. The shorter pieces, which will be the skirt for the back and sides, were seamed together. I sewed the pieces selvage to selvage, which is the pre-finished edge of the material, so I didn't have to worry about the seam fraying, which would otherwise be a real concern because silk chiffon is frustrating to work with on many counts, which means it is very prone to fraying. Here I'm just pressing the seam since silk chiffon also likes to pucker. And do you see the blue tape on the right side of the frame? I used that to mark the right side of the fabric because the metallic threads were slightly shinier on one side than the other, but it was really hard to tell and I didn't want to screw it up when sewing things together. Now I'm sewing 2 lines of stitching across the top edge of the skirt piece. The first is a 1/2 inch away from the edge, and the second is a 1/4 inch below the first, also known as 3/4 of an inch away from the edge. But these aren't normal lines of stitching. They are sewn using a large stitch length and low tension. I'm backstitching at one side and leaving the thread tails loose and long at the other. The thread tails are left long so I can pull on them, causing the fabric to gather like you see me doing here. This is a technique best used on thinner fabrics, and you want to do this very gently, because if the thread breaks, you are sort of screwed, and by screwed I mean you have to resew the line of stitching. But if all goes well, you'll have beautiful even gathers, and you'll have them in a fraction of the time it would have taken to hand sew them. I gathered this panel down to match the width of the bottom edge of the back and side back bodice pieces. Then I tied off the threads and arranged the material so the gathers were evenly dispersed across it. I lined the seam in this panel with the center back seam in the bodice panel. I also pinned the side edges of the pieces together, then pinned the fabric evenly between those points. Now I'm sewing the skirt on with the right sides facing each other, and I'm sewing between the 2 lines of stitching at the top edge of the skirt. This ensures the fabric will be nicely and precisely gathered at the point I'm stitching through, which is less of a guarantee when you are sewing above or below the point you gathered. That is why I like the double row of gathering stitches so much. It allows you to sew between the rows, ensuring they will look nice and pretty. After it was sewn on, I removed the second line of gathering stitches that extended beyond the seam allowance and was visible from the right side. I also pressed the seam allowance upward. That basically sorts out the back of the garment, so it is time for me to tackle the front. And for that, I first had to prep the base layer. I did that by notching the neckline and pressing that edge inward by 1/4 inch, which I will soon realize was a mistake, but luckily not a major one. At this point, I remembered I was going to add boning to this panel too, so I'm marking the boning channel placement, and these will run parallel to the seams and be spaced an inch or 2 apart. Much like with the back panels, I aligned and then sewed twill tape alongside those markings, and when doing this I folded the previously pressed edge flat. So that was reason 1 why I shouldn't have turned it inward, but reason 2 is that I realized I wanted this edge to sit below the chiffon overlay, so it wouldn't be visible when the garment was worn, which meant it had to be turned inward by an additional 1/2 inch. Which I didn't film, but here you can see me sewing that edge down. I added boning to the channels, then turned the bottom edge inward by 1/2 inch and stitched it down as well. My industrial machine sews through plastic boning just fine, but it is less advisable if you have a flimsier machine. You're likely to either break a needle or break the machine, or both. Now the base layer is prepped, so I got to work on the overlay. I drafted the pattern for the overlay by copying and then cutting my base pattern apart into strips. I separated the strips by several inches, keeping the waistline level, until the piece was about 8 times its original width. I smoothed out the curvature of the neckline and it was ready to be used. However, my fabric choice made it difficult for me to use this pattern, because another one of the many things I hate about silk chiffon is that it is shifty, both in spirit and in practice. Like, it literally shifts around a lot when you are trying to cut, or in my case, mark it. So instead of using chalk or anything to mark the material only to have it warp away in the process, I'm using basting stitches to transfer the horizontal channel placement onto both of the front pieces. I did this by laying chiffon atop the pattern and using pattern weights, aka sewing marshmallows, on either side to hold the material down. Since the chiffon is sheer, I could see the markings through the fabric and sew my basting stitches atop them. Then I moved the pattern weights to be near the edges of the pattern and cut the chiffon to match its dimensions. And once again, I'm using masking tape to mark the right side of the fabric. And the pattern actually only extends to what will be the waistline. The material is supposed to extend like 50 inches past it. But below the waist, it is pretty much a rectangle, so I'm just trimming it to the right width using the vertical stripes as a guide. Now I somewhat roughly turned the top edges inward by 1/3 of an inch or so, all the way from the center front to where the strap begins. I turned that inward by another 1/3 of an inch or so and stitched as close to the edge as I could. This creates a channel for one of the 3 pieces of elastic on each side. The other channels will be created with organza ribbon, and I chose organza ribbon for this because it is very thin and won't add a lot of bulk to the points where it is used, which is good because I'm using several yards of it, and it is positioned at the waist where I really don't need or want extra bulk. I lined one edge of the ribbon with the basting stitches, then stitched as close to that edge as I could. Then I stitched it 1/4 inch away from the top edge. I did this because the ribbon was wider than I needed it to be, and the elastic will look better in a channel closer to its width. After that was done, I pressed everything because chiffon puckers like a mother. Now, remember that thing I said about just because this is pink doesn't mean it's completely historically inaccurate? I take that back a little bit, because instead of having tapes threaded through the channels and tied at the center front, I'm using a 1/4 inch wide elastic. It's just so convenient, and you won't be able to tell. Well, you will, but only because I told you, otherwise I bet you wouldn't have noticed. And the people walking by while I photographed this project definitely didn't notice. Anyway, I cut lengths of elastic way longer than I needed them to be and threaded them through a bobby pin. Then I threaded the bobby pin through each channel until it came out the other end. The elastic was pinned to each end of the channel to prevent it from escaping and reseating into it. I did this for the channel at the neckline as well as the ribbon channels below it. Now I'm machine basting the ends of the elastic on the side edge and stay stitching from them to the top of this panel. And I'm leaving the ends of the elastic at the center front loose since they will need to be adjusted later on. But before adjusting them, I'm aligning the other edges with the edges of the base layer. The overlay is pinned to the base layer at the side edge with the edges even, and the bottom channel should align with the bottom edge of the base layer, since both of those will be positioned at the waistline. I pleated the overlay to fit the strap since it wasn't gathered down with the elastic, and the channel at the neckline extends past the base layer since this edge of the base layer was turned inward by an additional 1/2 inch, so it'll be hidden when the garment is worn. With that pinned, I machine basted the overlay to the base layer at the side edges and strap. Then I pinned the front panels to the back panels. I lined the bottom edges of the base layers first, ensuring that the waistline would be level, then pinned outward from that point. This seam was sewn with a 3/4 inch allowance, just like all the others, and it will extend from the underarm all the way to the hem of the garment, since I'm stitching past where the base layer ends and sewing the skirt portions together as well. After that was pressed, I pinned and sewed the straps to the front panels. I didn't mention it, but I did end up turning the front edge of the base layer inward before doing all this, and it was like this during all the footage you just saw. But then I put the garment on my dress form and it was time to adjust the elastic. I basically pulled on the elastic and arranged the gathers until everything sat nicely and clung to the body as it should. Here you can see a before and after, only the left side has been adjusted in this photo in case you couldn't tell. I repeated that on the other side, then took it off my dress form and ripped out the stitches securing the front of the base layer. Once it was freed, I aligned the front edge of the silk with this edge and pinned them together. I pinned from the bottom channel of the overlay upward and made sure a 1/4 inch of the overlay was overhanging the base layer at the neckline. Then I basted them together at the front edge. Okay, now it is time for sleeves and ruffles. They are both just rectangles, and unfortunately the vertical stripes and metallic threads prevented this material from tearing on the horizontal grain, which was super inconvenient. It meant I had to cut these out using scissors. And have I mentioned that I really hate cutting chiffon with scissors? I know I've hidden it well, but I actually just really hate working with chiffon in general. But I used said scissors to cut 2 rectangles for the sleeves and 2 rectangles/strips for the ruffle. I'll be working on the ruffles first because I procrastinate my problems and sleeves are always a problem. The soon-to-be roughly rectangles were seamed together selvage to selvage. Then I used my iron to turn both edges inward by about a 1/4 inch, and I used my new rolled hem foot to evenly turn it inward again by a 1/4 inch and stitch very close to the edge. I must say, I really like how this finish looks. The stitches are so close to the edge, it is super satisfying, but since I'm new to using this foot, I found it required a great deal of attention to feed the fabric into it and get that finish. But I definitely use it again in the future and hopefully get better at using it. I also want to point out that this ruffle will be folded in half, so I actually turned one edge's hem inward and one outward, meaning when it's on the garment, the interior of the hem won't be exposed, even though both sides of the fabric will be showing. I don't know if that really makes sense. I felt very clever when doing it, but trying to describe it just now makes me feel significantly less clever. I'm a visual learner and I'm a visual explainer too. That's why I make videos, not podcasts. I set aside the now hemmed strip to work on the sleeves for a bit. Much like with the front panels, I had to mark the placement for a ribbon channel that will have elastic threaded through it. And I repeated the method shown on the front panels and used basting stitches to transfer its placement onto the fabric. But before sewing the ribbon on, I turned the bottom edge inward by a generous ½ inch, smoothing it out in the process since it was a little jagged. See my previous point about not liking cutting chiffon with scissors, or working with chiffon in general. I folded the end of the ribbon inward by a ½ inch and positioned it 1 inch away from what will be the underarm seam of the sleeve. It was then sewn on 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge, and once both edges of the ribbon were sewn down, it captures the raw edge of the hem and prevents it from fraying. And once I reached the other edge of the fabric, I cut the ribbon and turned it inward and ended it 1 inch away from what will be the other side of the underarm seam. I repeated this, including the folding and early ending of the ribbon along the line I marked with basting stitches. Then I sewed up the side/underarm seam with a 3/4 inch allowance, and the right sides facing each other. And you'll notice in doing this, I am not sewing the ends of the ribbon channels closed, because they start a 1/4 inch away from the seam, or at least that was my goal. That seam was pressed open, then I adjusted my stitch length and tension to mimic the settings I used for the skirt piece much earlier on. I used those settings and the same method to sew 2 lines of stitching 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch away from the top edge of each sleeve. Then I sewed 1 line of stitching near the center of the soon-to-be ruffle strip. I wanted this to be off-center by 1 inch, but I didn't want to mark the fabric, so I'm using masking tape on my machine plate as a guide. If the edge of the fabric is level with the edge of the tape, the stitching will be in the right place. I feel like this video is coming off as a subtle ad for masking tape, but I swear it's not. I pulled on the loose thread tails to gather my strip into a beautiful ruffle, slightly longer than the length of the bodice neckline. That process will be repeated at the top of each sleeve, but first I'm threading elastic through the channels I created. However, this time, instead of pinning the ends of the elastic to either end of the channel, I'm pinning the ends together so they'll form loops. Then off camera, I stitched a 1/2 inch away from the ends, then I sewed another line of stitching a 1/2 inch away from that. I clipped the excess elastic close to the first line of stitching, and now the elastic's in a loop that moves freely inside the channel. Now the top edge is gathered down, this time to match the arm side of the bodice, which it was then pinned into. I lined and pinned the underarm seam first, then pinned outward from that point, using excess material to sit at the top of the shoulder, since that is where I want the most volume to be. The sleeves were sewn on with a 1/2 inch allowance, then I sewed a 1/4 inch away from that line of stitching and trimmed close to the second line of stitching. The thought process with this is that the fabric won't fray beyond the second line of stitching, but it allows you to cut most of the seam allowance away, meaning less bulk and more mobility at the point of attachment. I wanted the seam allowance to be folded outward atop the base layer, but didn't really want to do that, so I used whip stitches to baste it into that position. Because if it won't bend to my will, then I'll sew it to my will, I guess. Which could come off as a bit threatening and turn out to be a little bit gory depending on the circumstances. I used my iron to turn the raw edge on the back panels and straps inward by a 1/2 inch. Some of these had to be notched to turn inward nicely. Then they were basted in place using whip stitches as well. Now I'm turning the front edge inward and whip stitching its edges to the interior of the base layer. And after all that, it was looking pretty nice from the exterior and a lot less nice from the interior. To fix that, I used the pattern for the base layer to cut lining from a lightweight cotton. These pieces were seamed together using 3/4 inch seam allowances, then the top and bottom edges were turned inward by a 1/2 inch and pressed. The interior of the bodice looked like this before lining, and like this after lining. I positioned it simply by lining the seams and edges and pinning outward from those points. It's worth mentioning that the lining is pinned to the interior of the base layer. The overlay on the front panels is still unattached to the fitted lining at the waist and neckline. The lining was sewn in place using tiny whip stitches by hand, and this is why I was so concerned with the positioning of the skirt and sleeve seam allowances. I wanted them to all sit atop the base layer so they would be covered when the lining was added. Here's the finished lining, and the stitches could have been tinier, I'll admit, but the overall interior looks much, much better. And here you can see how the overlay remains separate from the base layer. Now it's time to finish the neckline properly, and by properly I mean with a ruffle, as all things should be finished with. Unlike with the lining, the ruffle is actually sewn directly onto the overlay, though I'm stretching the elastic slightly as I sew the ruffle to it so it won't lose its elasticatedness. Or flexibility. Flexibility would be a more logical word to use there. When the front panel ends, the elastic is just whipped to the neckline through both the overlay and base layer. I wanted the ruffle to be folded in half, so I'm actually creasing it on the stitch point where it was gathered and whip stitching it to the fabric through that point. I thought this would really encourage it to take the shape I wanted, and maybe it did, but it wasn't enough. I ended up steaming it down using my iron to get it the way I wanted. Here you can see one half after being steamed and one half in its own natural state. And after it was all pressed in place and looking much more like I had envisioned. Now it's time for closures, and if I had made this the historical way, ribbon would extend out from the channels and tie at the center front, securing the bodice in place. But I did not do that, so instead I'm sewing hooks and eyes at the points where the elastic ends. Now I'm sewing up at the front skirt seam since at this point it was still wide open. I did this with a large seam allowance since I left like 2 inches of allowance at this point. I left the top 10 or so inches of the seam open to make it easy to get on and off, and this was sewn selvage to selvage, so once again fraying wasn't a concern. Afterward I pressed the seam open, then the dress was plopped onto my dress form, and I had the terrifying task of leveling the hem by eye. I did not film it because it was stressful, and I think trying to show the process would have made me way more likely to screw up. I think I did an okay job, but there was very little seam allowance remaining, certainly not enough for the 2-inch wide hems I typically prefer and actually had planned for this project. So once it looked as level as it was going to get, I ironed the bottom edge inward by a 1/2 inch, then pulled out my rolled hem foot once again and hemmed this edge. I think I was slightly better at this time, but it still wasn't great. At this point I was like, great, it's done. And then I looked at it again and was like, but wait, it's completely sheer. Like these dresses were scandalous, but not that scandalous. The petticoats would actually save me from the dress being overly revealing, but my petticoats are white and didn't look great beneath the pink chiffon. This underskirt consists of 2 rectangles, and they were seamed together down the back and seamed together most of the way down the front. But I left the top 10 inches open to match the opening in the overlay, and these edges were turned inward, then top stitched down, and both seams were pressed open. Then I hemmed the bottom edge, and I'm pretty sure I did a rolled 1/2 inch hem here, but I cannot remember, and checking it would require me to stand up and go into the basement, and there are spiders down there. So we'll never know the true width of this hem. I very sloppily gathered the top edge just by pushing the fabric underneath the presser foot. I did this a couple times until it was gathered down to 1/4 of its original width. Then I bound the edge with twill tape to prevent it from fraying. The twill tape was then whip stitched to the bottom edge of the cotton lining. And now the dress was done, but it needed something else, and that something was a sash. Since chemise ailerons are typically white, the sash was often the colorful part of the outfit, made from some brightly colored silk. But I'll be honest, bright pink with metallic gold stripes is hard to pair with something contrasty without it verging on tacky. And the last thing I would want my bright pink metallic striped dress to be is tacky. So I ended up finding this floral silk chiffon in my stash, and the warm base color looked really good with the gold, and the pink flowers matched the dress beautifully. I cut 3 strips of this, then seamed them together using French seams. The edges were once again hemmed with my handy rolled hemming foot. The short ends of the sash were knotted and trimmed to resemble cloth tassels. And that was officially it. The dress and its accessory were done and ready to be worn. So I wore it and photographed it, and now we can admire it together. I'm personally very pleased with how it turned out. I knew I'd love the color, but I really love it as a finished dress too, and I think the fit is great. The structure beneath it makes it surprisingly flattering, especially compared to my previous attempts, so I feel like I redeemed myself in that regard. And though this fabric was horrible to work with, being chiffon and all, I think it redeemed itself too, by being freaking gorgeous. I know the color won't be to everyone's taste, especially for a historically inspired costume, but pairing unusual textiles with historical silhouettes and techniques will always be one of my favorite things, and this dress is no exception to that. I'd say the only thing I don't love about it is the construction. I was having some machine problems throughout that show in the interior, and I regret doing so much by machine. I feel like I should have at least hand-sewed the hems. When neglecting accuracy with the textile, it's easy to neglect it in every aspect, which I definitely did a little bit on this one. But obviously, historical accuracy isn't everything, and I'm very pleased with the dress I ended up with. I actually have another fantasy meets 18th century project almost finished, and I should have videos up about it soon. So subscribe and stay tuned for that, and leave a like and comment if you enjoyed this one. Before I go, I did just want to give a huge thank you to all of my very wonderful patient patrons. These are the credits from August, and I wanted to give a shout out to my top tier patrons, who are Amanda Amishar, Jamie Denon, Riley S., Mary Kinsey, Vita Taramina, Ezra Hargrave, and Jordan Carpenter. Thanks so much for your support. It really does mean the world to me, and thank you so much for watching. I will talk to all of you very soon.